Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back. And today I want to mention a few things about the tragic event that took place in New Zealand with the mosque shooting, the Christchurch mosque terrorist attack, which is really an attack not only on a community of immigrants, but also basically on New Zealand itself as a country, because it's unprecedented. It's an unprecedented incident in the country itself, and also it does change the landscape of the country itself, the political landscape, the the social realities on the ground, the feelings of insecurity, amongst immigrants, and so on and so forth. So the ripple effects of such a terrorist attack, obviously, are, in a sense, it's really devastating. It's not only the lives that were lost, and of course we pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant all the victims of this attack Jannah, not only the ones that have passed on, but also the ones that endure. We ask Allah to put patience in their hearts, and also to help us come to some sort of lasting solution to terrorism, extremism, from all sides, really. But what I want to do is I basically want to explore the phenomena of terrorism, and also just say emphatically that an attack like this, on a mosque, was not something that took place in a political vacuum, and it does have a context, and that context and the insight into that context is provided by the terrorist himself, who left a manifesto which I read, and gave me some insight into his mindset. And dare I say, it was not a very unfamiliar mindset. It's not unlike the mindset I've heard, ironically, from other terrorists, or even from so-called Muslim terrorists, and I can kind of immediately draw a parallel between some of what he was saying and some of what, for example, Osama bin Laden, said back in his day when he was inspiring terrorism and perpetrating acts of terrorism. So there's really, no difference. A terrorist is a terrorist at the end of the day, But what do you need, essentially, in order to perpetrate such heinous acts? What do people need to be able to perpetrate acts of mass murder? What does it take? So I'm gonna talk about that for a bit. Firstly, there is a deep sort of motive in these kinds of attacks that I would say is rooted in identity politics, that goes far beyond the individual. So let me put that out there, okay? When someone takes a gun or a bomb and goes and perpetrates an act of violence on any particular group of people, there is a discourse behind that, okay? And often that discourse is sanctioned by other people, by a group or an ideology much larger than the individual who goes out and finally pulls the trigger. So what I'm saying is basically is that we need to look into what that discourse is, and we need to put that discourse on trial. So when we're talking about this attack or similar attacks to this, whether it's coming from white supremacy, whether it's coming from Christian fundamentalism, whether it's coming from Muslim radicalization, there is essentially a discourse that is accompanied with these types of acts that enable these people to do what they do, okay? Because most of the time, or I could say 10 out of 10 times, when people perpetrate such heinous acts, they believe that they're doing something for the greater good. Let me say that again. They believe what they are doing is for the greater good and the furthering of their cause. These are not people, these are not thieves and robbers, someone whose motive can easily be ascertained. Just, okay, he shot somebody because he wanted to steal the car. Okay, easy, the motive is obtained, right? There it is, he wanted the car, there was resistance, he killed someone in the pursuit of that objective, easily understandable objective, right? In these type of cases, you get someone like the terrorist that left a manifesto so that people could understand what his objective was. He highlighted his objectives very clearly. He stated what motivated him. Some of it was very emotive. And basically, in summary, he's a white supremacist. He stated clearly that he was greatly disturbed by what he saw as the invasion of European lands by immigrants, and the fact that they breed much more. In other words, immigrants have a lot more kids, and that they are imposing their culture, their values and traditions on a white people, or thereby somehow rendering white tradition impure or mixing up of traditions. So what he's really saying in essence is that the white people must have a homeland of their own, and the European countries are those homelands, and therefore it should not be contaminated by foreign elements, by immigrants coming with foreign cultures, religions, identities, and basically settling there and then outbreeding white people, okay, by virtue of them having lots of kids, and so on and so forth, okay. So what it's telling is that his motive was not so much, his attack was not Islamophobic, okay, let me clear that, okay. Muslims have sort of had a victimized approach to things because of the mass Islamophobia that exists in Western media, in Western movies. Since I was a kid, long before any major terrorist attacks happened, most of the movies portray Arabs and Muslims as terrorists. Whenever you see an Arab in an American movie, the bad guy, right? Sometimes I wondered, like with my own kids growing up, I sometimes wondered how they should feel that most of the villains in every movie that they watch, shares the religion that they profess to follow or believe in. Most of the villains use words and phrases that they are quite familiar with as religious words and phrases. Seeing movies where the terrorist is the guy running around with a Kalashnikov or AK-47 shouting Allahu Akbar and these types of things. How do you feel? How do you grow up constantly being told by the media that you're the bad guy? So there is a definitive vilification of Muslims in the media, and there has been a very big sort of influence, in the media, where it has sort of snowballed or facilitated Islamophobia. And not since now, okay? I'm talking about the 90s, okay? 1990s, since then, since for a long time, okay? Western media has portrayed Muslims in a very negative light long before terrorism, okay? But so Muslims have this victimized approach where they feel like they're the victims constantly, and that they need to be on defense, and that people are always going to say bad things about them, especially in Western media. Long before ISIS, long before all these political terrorist groups became sort of part of mainstream media, and before any major terrorist attacks happened, Muslims were vilified in the media and portrayed in a negative light. So there's that aspect. So when this New Zealand a terrorist attack took place in New Zealand at the Christchurch Mosque, the natural reaction I saw, observing from a lot of Muslims, was they just saw this as another Islamophobic thing, another extension of Islamophobic, an attack on Muslims in the West. And they immediately started jumping on the defensive and said that this guy, the terrorist, is not going to be called a terrorist, okay, because he's not Muslim. Only Muslims can be terrorists, which wasn't true, okay. The Prime Minister and the mayor in New Zealand immediately came out and called it a terrorist attack. So this was labeled a terrorist attack from the start. The shooter was called a terrorist from the start. The narrative was not skewed or changed because he was white. And so we have to applaud New Zealand for that foresight. Yes, in some American media outlets, they were hesitant to call him a terrorist. Okay, let's be honest, right? They were. White people are not terrorists in America, right? But then we kind of got a sense of the media, also the Western media outlets, portraying this terrorist as a sweet, innocent kid growing up in a pretty normal way, and then being radicalized somewhere along his trips because he had saved some money and decided to do a few to tour a few countries, one of them being Pakistan, allegedly, and even showing tweets where he actually commended Pakistani people for being very friendly. But it's essentially trying to humanize him, and saying, look, this guy who did this heinous act, something really seriously went wrong in his life. Yes, I'm sure that's obviously something went wrong, right? People don't just normally do this type of thing. But what I want to say is that there does exist a double standard, because when anyone else perpetrates any sort of person of color or from an ethnic group, so to say, and we always refer to ethnic groups as being people of color, when it comes from the white perspective, do anything that is remotely violent, the media tends not to look for an explanation, okay? They tend to say, oh, so-and-so did something for no apparent reason, just acts of aggression, for no apparent reason, and that's apparently always acceptable when it comes to Muslims who perpetrate crimes and acts of terrorism. and so on. It's just like, oh, okay, we just accept the narrative that Muslims portray acts of terrorism. Those Muslims who have portrayed acts of terrorism, we assume that these acts of terrorism originate in their religion. So, duh, right? Like, no duh, like, of course, right? It's an Arab. Terrorism, Arab. Terrorism, Muslim. Terrorism, Pakistani. Terrorism. So that's kind of been the brand, I'm surprised that no one felt offended, like how dare you call a non-Muslim person a terrorist? I mean, isn't that like reserved for Muslims, So, yeah, so it's kind of that whole Islamophobic thing, going on with the Muslim community, that victimization type of attitude. They felt you could see the initial responses from Muslims, kind of went along those lines. So I want to say, and basically I'm saying this to kind of offset and avert this type of dangerous dialogue that almost all extremists play into, and that is this dialogue where they believe in this sort of Armageddon, the clash of civilizations, the West, the white West, white civilization versus the other, that's the one narrative, or Islam versus the West, that's the other narrative, the clash of civilizations. And I just want to basically dismiss that immediately and say there is no clash of civilizations. There are no two civilizations, basically. There's only one civilization in the world. There are no two civilizations. There are no clashes in civilization. There are no us and them, or these things are basically, in today's globalized world, we all basically in it together. Okay, the us and them is fictional. Okay, maybe in the past you could look at the world in that way, but to look at the world in that way in today's time is just dumb, basically. Okay, so let me just dismiss that. But almost all extremists play into this narrative. Okay, this identity politics, us and them. Okay, and us and them means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So firstly, let me just say that the terrorist attack was not Islamophobic. It was incidental that the place he attacked was the mosque. He said so himself. He said it was an easy target, and it was a place with a maximum amount of immigrants. And his target was immigrants, whites who have immigrated to New Zealand. And it so happened that that was the easiest target, and a lot of immigrants in New Zealand happen to be Muslim, okay, in this guy's sort of mindset. And so when asked if he has a problem essentially with Muslims or with Islam, he said, look, if people practice their own cultures and traditions and religions within their own countries, that's fine. So basically what he's saying is that his goal is to preserve white culture and white civilization, what he sees as white civilization. And he doesn't want invaders to come, immigrants to be sort of conquering. It's kind of like a soft version of conquering, right? White lands, when white soldiers have fought so hard and died to gain those lands in the first place. So he cites one very emotive story about how he stood outside the graveyard. He drove to this graveyard somewhere in France, and there was graves lined up with fallen comrades and soldiers and so on, and he sat in his car crying because he feels what they have fought for is now being lost. Okay, look, I'm not gonna lie to you, but actually he's right. It's true what he's saying, and And that was a narrative in the old world. Okay, the narrative that he's following was actually a mainstream narrative in the old world. Okay, the French colonized North Africa, Algeria, Morocco, these places, and they thought in colonizing these places that they are obviously taking over these lands, profiting from the wealth of these lands, which they still do up till this day. But they could not, what they could not stop was that obviously once you colonize a land and you teach people your language, which is French, and they start identifying with you, you know, on these kind of common grounds, France then also becomes their homeland. It's as simple as that. Okay? It's not that the Algerians or Moroccans came to France to conquer France. No. You conquered their lands, you colonized their lands, and now they are coming, in fact, to their country because you made them believe that. It's as simple as that. Okay? You made them believe that. You taught them your language. You have spread in your culture, and they are every bit as French as you are, actually, because you made them that. Okay, so it's just basically, you know, they are coming home. When Moroccans and Algerians and all these Muslim Arabs come, these are Muslim Arabs who speak French. These are people who also eat French dishes, and these are people who in part have been socialized in a French way because you colonized them. Okay, so they coming back home. They have every right to be in France because it's their country too, just like you once considered their homelands to be yours. So this is just the reality of the situation. And what I found ironic is that when he considered, you know, for example, New Zealand to be a European country, and therefore immigrants should not be allowed to settle there, especially non-white immigrants. The irony of it all is that white people are immigrants in New Zealand. White people are immigrants in Australia. Okay? The original people in those lands are not white. Right? So should a native New Zealanders and Aboriginals in Australia, should they be perpetrating terrorist attacks on white people and saying, look, we want to maintain our culture and our heritage, which, by the way, white people came and ruined. White people came and killed off half of, or more than half of these people, of native Australians, native New Zealanders, native anywhere they went. Okay? When white people colonized, they disrupted the culture. Okay? They amalgamated people's cultures with their cultures, as happens, and often they forced Christianity on them. Okay? They came with Christianity, viewing it as a white religion, and forced Christianity on these people. So, but that's fine, right? So the point of it is that the narrative that this unfortunate guy, this terrorist, is playing into is an actual narrative. It's an historical narrative. It's the narrative of the colonizer. The colonizer had the Bible and white supremacy linked together in his mind, and it made it okay for him to perpetrate all the horrors and injustices that he perpetrated against people of color. Because firstly, they were heathens, the people of color, okay? They were not Christian, they were heathens, and they needed to be tamed. And the way they needed to be tamed was forced converted to Christianity and civilized in that way. But even after becoming Christian and embracing the religion, the so-called religion of white people, we'll get back to that, they were not even then considered equal. Okay? Even worshipping a white god didn't make them equal. Okay? So this kind of white supremacy, has basically is part of what the white empire took around the world. It's part of what the colonizers, the ideology of colonizers, of white colonizers, was built on white supremacy and Christianity. Okay, now also, interestingly, the New Zealand terrorist, does not consider himself particularly Christian. He doesn't consider himself being motivated by Christianity. He does accept that there can be various cultures within white people, among white people, as long as they're authentically white. So he doesn't consider Islam one of them. For example, he says that he doesn't have a problem with Muslims and people being Muslim and practicing their own cultures and religions within their own countries. But what he does hate most of all are people who convert to Islam, Europeans who convert to Islam, because for him that is betraying their own culture, turning their back on their own culture and their own religions, whatever that is, by adopting a tradition or religion that's essentially alien to white people, that being Islam. Now, the biggest problem I see, besides this individual might have been extremely psychologically impaired or disturbed, he's also not, of course, widely read or very intelligent, because frankly, Christianity is not a white religion. Christianity became a white religion. It was adopted from the Middle East, ironically. Talking about white people being authentically white, there's no such thing as authentically white in our time. White people follow a religion and worship, some of them worship a god. If their version of Christianity is to worship Jesus, then they're worshiping a brown Middle Eastern Israelite Palestinian man. Okay? Isa, Jesus. So that's not authentically white. I mean, your whole religious tradition you are taking from the Middle East. Christianity is a Middle Eastern religion, much like Islam, much like Judaism, and there is nothing authentically white about it at all, not even remotely. So this type of thing that that sees, for example, the Western world as being the Christian world, and the Eastern world being the Islamic world, and it's a clash of civilizations, and that's all bullshit. There's no Western civilization. The West doesn't have a civilization. Okay? Every civilization comes from the Middle East. Okay? If Western society is premised on Christianity, as some people assert, then Western society's civilization originates in the Middle East. Simple as that. Okay? So there is no other civilization. There's only one civilization. That civilization is the civilization premised on Middle Eastern religions, which are the Abrahamic religions, which all stem from the Middle East, and so there's no other civilization. There's only a Middle Eastern civilization, basically. Right? So that's the one thing I want to say. The other thing is that when we look at this whole kind of white supremacist ideology that this unfortunate terrorist has bought into, then it is not something alien to where many within sort of the white dispensation have at some point come from. Yes, arguably, and not arguably, actually, as a matter of fact, okay, the vast majority of people, white and others, have distanced themselves from the paradigms of the old world, okay? The paradigms of clash of civilizations, the paradigm of a superiority racial superiority. These are not things that in our time are considered acceptable by and large in popular discourse. Racism is not considered acceptable by and large in popular discourse. Yes, there are undertones of racism, but people sort of don't come up and in your face and say, look, I'm racist. I don't like white people. I don't like black people or whatever. Okay, because you're black, you can't get the job, or because you're white, or people. These things are sort of a taboo in our time. It's not something acceptable. So many people have distanced themselves from that type of thinking, and many white people even, are very apologetic for the past, for apartheid in South Africa, for colonization, for disadvantaging people of color, and all these types of things. And they have, through legislation, through lenient immigration policies, through all these types of things, they have tried to atone for the sins of the past, let's put it that way. Atone for the sins of their ancestors who went around enslaving all people of color and doing horrible things, okay? So this wave, this anti-immigration wave, is now sort of trying to reverse the efforts of white countries which are no longer white really. Many countries that are historically white have huge populations of non-white people. But anyway, they have tried to kind of reverse this kind of negativity by incorporating people of color into so-called white societies, and showing themselves to be rather egalitarian, non-racist, and quite willing to see the world in terms of people as people other than color, basically, not on the basis of race. So the world has progressed a lot in that direction, and now obviously there are some people who are trying to undo it. They're trying to create a kind of identity politic that would be very counterproductive, would be very dangerous, and would start a whole lot of shit, okay? So we gotta kind of be on our guard for that as people in this globalized world, where there really is only one civilization, there's no clash of civilizations, and where we really are either in it together and the boat floats, or the ship, stays afloat, or we start to create some bullshit that wasn't there. We try to sort of create identity scenarios, identity politics. We play into extremist identity politics. We play into the idea of the clash of civilizations. We play into the idea of racial biases and some other bullshit. There's a whole lot of different sort of identity politics. There's a whole lot of kind of games that people are playing around these things to create power bases for themselves, to divide people. And when we go down that road, people, whether you are Muslim or Christian or Jewish or Hindu or white or black or whatever, yellow, pink, purple, the minute we go down that road, people, we will sink, not as a country, okay, but as a global world, because the world is a different place now, okay? It's a globalized world. It's a world where things can be set off in motion in the remotest corner of the world and affect the other corner of the world. That's the world we live in. We live in a world of global economies. We live in the world of global politics, and a disaster for one is a disaster for all. And so my message is, don't play into this bullshit. Don't play into identity politics, and embrace the fact that at the end of the day, the bottom line, we all just people. وصلى الله على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.